Hello, I'm Brad Kelly, and you're listening to Method and Madness. This is a show about books, the people who write them, and the labyrinth to be explored between the words.
Have you ever heard about Willie the Weeper? Had a job as a chimney sweeper. He had the dope habit and he had his bad. Listen while I tell you about a dream he had.
I'm joined today by Matt Cardin. He is the author or editor of 12 books, including Dark Awakenings, which includes 7 works of short fiction and 3 essays that live at the crossroads of religion and horror. He's also the author of To Rouse Leviathan, a collection of excellent short stories. Definitely, I recommend both of these, but To Rouse Leviathan was sort of my entry point to reading Matt's work, and I really, really like it. This is a collection of excellent short stories in the tradition of weird fiction and cosmic horror. He also has a great Substack, The Living Dark, which listeners of this show I think will really enjoy if you're not already subscribed. Links to that will obviously be in the show notes. And most recently, he has published a book called Writing at the Wellspring, subtitled Tapping the Source of Your Inner Genius, which will be the primary focus of our conversation today. It's a book on writing unlike any other that I've read, focusing not on mechanical techniques, literary theory, or the structural secrets of great writers, but rather on the powerful creative force within and how one might make peace with it for better writing and perhaps even for better living. So, Matt, first of all, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And second, thanks so much for writing this book.
Thank you, Brad. I appreciate the intro, and I appreciate the invitation to be here. This is at the end of a work day at my college for me right now, so I'm kind of tired, and I figure talking about these things may energize me, so I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, good. Yeah. It's funny. I find this sometimes I've got a recording coming up and I'm like, we'll do it, but I don't know where I'll be. And then by the end, I'm all jazzed up. So maybe we'll get there. I want to kind of start this conversation sort of where you start the book, in that it's an epigraph to part 1 of Writing at the Wellspring. And this is a quote from Carl Gustav Jung. Quote, "A creative person has little power over his own life. He is not free. He is captive and driven by his daemon." I feel like this is a really good place to start to get a sense of where you're going in this book. But why select that quote? What does that quote mean for you?
Jung was famous for having, you could almost say discovered, although he didn't, but in his own way, brought forth in a very forceful way what he referred to sometimes as the objectivity of the psyche. And by that, he meant that though we commonly think of the psyche as being just our subjective element, the inner world, our inner self, in fact, it has its own thing going on. That when we're talking about the psyche, it's real. It's not just theoretical. It's something real, something that we can actually delve into, and something that we can talk about as a really existing entity. And that, of course, he was speaking in the face of early 20th century and late 19th century scientism and, reductionism and that kind of thing. And for him, the idea that the psyche is real also was deeply connected to, as you referred to, the daemon and the daimonic. And so when he talked about a creative person not having really much say over his or her own life, that ties right into his overall system of psychology, which is saying there's something independent. There's something we know that's what a daimon refers to, or a demon, D-A-E-M-O-N, right? If you're transliterating from the ancient Greek, it's D-A-I-M-O-N. It's an independent spirit, and the psychologized or spiritualized version of this ancient Greek concept, this ancient Western concept, is that we each have a separate, it's almost like a higher self or an angel or a demon or something like that. And that's what Jung was getting at. And I start the book on that note because to me, that summarizes, expresses, encapsulates pretty much everything about our experience of ourselves and our experience of creativity. So I'm kind of getting in a wordy way at answering your initial question. But when I start with that quote and devote the entire first third of the book to it, and of course it appears in the rest of the book, that's because that sort of emerged, that theme of there being this creative self that is not me as I feel myself to be in my first person ego, but something that is me, but separate from me, that I'm collaborating with and that is communicating with me, that emerged as the master key for me to understand, like I said, kind of everything about my own life and about my drive to write and make music and other things that I had done for years when I finally had a name to put on it. And Jung was one of the people who helped me do that.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I particularly like, I mean, I like all of that. And I'm really interested in part of this quote, and I think it's based on some conversations I had years ago with sort of people I'd run into, and I'd sort of mentioned to them that I was writing, working on fiction. I write novels and short stories. And this notion that you'd get from people who sort of weren't participating in it, that what I was engaged in and what other writers and artists were engaged in was this sort of freewheeling, they can kind of do whatever they want sort of thing.
Yeah.
And on one level, it does look like that, I think, from the outside, right? You're just spending all this time on this thing you're interested in. But inside of the process, it often feels like you don't have a whole lot of choice exactly. I mean, I learned eventually to like get a handle on it to some degree, but it's sort of like, no, I have homework every night for the rest of my life. It's not, it's not all that liberating of an experience in the way that you think it is. Yeah.
Hey, Harlan Ellison famously discovered Dan Simmons at a writing seminar, writing retreat, and he praised to the high heavens the story. I think what's the name of that story? Upstream from the River Styx, something like that.
Okay.
That Simmons had submitted for that. This is before Simmons was, Dan Simmons, the best-selling novelist, and
right.
And of course, Ellison famously was just furious with everybody all the time, and he just cut people down in those things. Praise Simmons to high heavens, and in Simmons's recalling of it, and in Ellison's, he points out. I've read several recountings of this, that he told everybody there, you all think that I just dumped on this one person that he had just said horrible things about their story they'd brought, and you think I praised him, and he said, you don't realize I've put a curse on Dan Simmons. So for the rest of his life, he is not going to have a life. He's not going to have control over his life. He's going to have personal relationship troubles. His wife is going to be fighting against the mistress of his writing for the rest of his life. This is going to dominate him. I found that to be powerful when I heard that Ellison, who was kind of, you might say, a demonically possessed writer himself in a big way,
Sure.
that he would say that, and Simmons confirms that at the beginning of his writing career, I am praising you. I am cursing you. This thing has a hold of you. You don't have a hold of it.
Yeah. It does end up being sort of a blessing and a curse for sure in that way. Yeah. That's a great little anecdote, and I'd never heard that before. And yes, Harlan Ellison is sort of famous for being extremely curmudgeonly, and I've looked up videos and interviews of him just because I want to see him kind of blow up at somebody or
Great.
he's everybody. He's the science fiction world's like angry uncle. He's a great character.
If you remember Stephen King in Dance Macabre at the end, when he was talking about certain modern writers he recommended, he talked about Harlan Ellison, whom he knew, and he'd talked to him on the phone, and as I recall, I think he said, talking to Harlan Ellison is like talking to an apocalyptic vacuum cleaner salesman who's just dropped 3 large bennies. So,
that's incredible.
That's one of the best characterizations I ever heard anyone give of another writer.
Yeah, for sure. I wanted to ask you about another quote that shows up. I'm not even sure where it shows up in the book, but I know I've heard you reference it in interviews, and I think it's caught up in all of this same sort of topic. I'm pretty sure it's in Writing at the Wellspring somewhere. And this is from the Gospel of Thomas. And it goes, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. And I don't want to just throw the same question, what does that mean to you? But I see this as being, so the daemon is this thing in your framework in this book, and sort of what you've discovered in your career and your reading and your writing, is this thing that you sort of interact with. That's on some level part of you, but is also in many ways distinct from you.
Mhm.
But it strikes me that this quote, the thing that you're bringing forth, is maybe different than that. Are you in part? Is the idea that you're in partnership with this daemon to bring, quote unquote, what is within you out? Is that kind of how you see that working?
Yeah, and what you bring up as a question is probably good for interrogation, but I'm not going to devote any huge thought to it right here
Yeah.
because I probably would, go on and on about it in as I'm figuring it out. But yes, that passage, that verse from the Thomas Gospel is a favorite of many people in creativity, and it's also a favorite in the spiritual circles, like Elaine Pagels, who wrote the Gnostic Gospels, and the religion scholar who wrote so many other good books too. Um, she has talked about how it's an important verse for her. People who know the Thomas Gospel know that verse. If you
Sure.
bring forth what's within you, it will save you. If you don't bring forth what's within you, it will destroy you. Well, that's the Jesus of the Thomas Gospel saying that. He may not mean what I'm taking it to mean in a creative context with the daimon, but I will say that I don't personally make too huge of a difference between that and the daimon. I really don't, and this is where I want to switch over into referring it as the demon with the DAE. And the daimonic or the demonic personality is a term from some psychologies, and it refers to somebody who is uh, really passionate, really driven. And it doesn't have to be just creative people. Napoleon was a demonic personality, someone who was, whether you want to take it metaphorically or literally, possessed by this energy that just wouldn't let him go. And there are people that like that, and there are people we see in history who are like that. And it's an explosive energy that comes from within them, the demonic. And it doesn't mean demonic is evil. I know it's
Yeah.
it's older than that, but uh,
Yeah.
but uh, that's kind of how it's linked to the idea of the Thomas Gospel verse. There, it's that there's this energy that's in all of us, right? You mentioned earlier. You said, in one sense, it feels like you're in control of your writing. And I've heard other
Mhm.
writers talk about this before. They say, I think it's so cool that I can just go and I can make these characters do whatever I want. And there are composers who will do the same thing. I've heard them talk about it. It's just exciting sometimes. They'll be messing with this melody and these harmonies and these progressions and be like, it's just empowering. I realize I'm making this stuff. I could just do anything I want with it. Great. That's true. That is one level that this happens at. You said you're free to, I'm free to follow my interests and just do this stuff. But that's the trap door right there. My
Really.
interests. Where the hell do my interests come from? Can I choose to be interested in this, or are those just given to you? There's your involuntary side coming out right there.
Mhm.
Ultimately, I have as much control and you have as much control over your creativity or anything in your life as you have over the fact that you were born, when you were born, to whom you were born, where you were born, in the culture you were born, that your biology is like this, your genetics are like this, you and I look like this, we sound like this, we're speaking this language. How much control do you have over those things? Our creativity is a subset of this thing that none of us had any say in. And
Yeah.
so it's got the same involuntariness behind it. The thing within you in this framing is whatever that force is that gave rise and that is now giving rise to you and me in the first place, you know?
Right. Right.
And
Right.
on that level, uh, it's just something that's happening. It's something that's coming out of you. You are shepherding it. You're either cooperating with it or fighting against it.
Mhm.
And it can be a real comeuppance if you find that you're crossways with the way you have ordered your life, the way you've chosen to live, the relationships that you consent to or that you get rid of that you shouldn't have, the way you pursue whatever creativity is given to you. For you and me, it's largely writing. And a lot of people have found, we all know of the artists and the writers and the musicians and even the thinkers for whom the whole tortured artist, the tortured genius archetype or stereotype is in effect. There's something to that. You don't have to be a tortured artist. There's lots of good takedowns saying that that's a myth. It doesn't have to be that way. But the fact that it goes that way so often for so many people, they totally screw up their human relationships. They are addicted in some way. They make irresponsible decisions and destroy everything, and their art seems to be inseparable from that. There's a combination of you bringing forth what is within you, but also screwing that up because it's a volcanic force that tends to get out of control going on in a life like that. There's various angles to get into the truth in a creative context, looking at it in terms of writing creativity of what's in that verse. If you bring forth what is within you, you might say, the Jesus of the Thomas Gospel says it will save you. I guess if you do it right, it will save you. If you do it somewhat wrong, try to own it too much, or if you just deny it or warp it in some way, it will burn you up. That is the experience of a great many people. We see it happening, and we can see it within ourselves sometimes.
Yeah, no, I'm nodding along vigorously to all of this because it makes so much sense. And I think I sometimes think that the sort of the artists, creative types who have I don't even know if I think this. I think it's kind of a fact. Those who have some degree of longevity in their career, they don't just have a great album when they're 23 and then that's it. They have a decades long productive arc. Are the people who kind of learn to wrangle this. They may have an early period where, they ruin their relationships, they get addicted, all these things sort of happen. And then at some point they learn to kind of steer the ship somehow and focus all of that energy in a productive direction. Yeah, I know that's been true for me to some degree. I think I had to take a lot of stuff that was very chaotic and all over the place. It took me a while to, explain. I'm very, very happily married now, but I did go through some relationships where I didn't sort of properly set them up for, no, it's Thursday, like it's Thursday night. I'm writing right now. I'm not going on a date. I'm not my time is dedicated to this thing. And it can definitely leave people around you very perplexed and distressed about it because they don't really seem to understand what you're doing, if not undergoing. Yeah,
absolutely. I've been married for more than 3 decades now, and in many ways, based on how the first 10 to 12 years of that went, there were various factors playing into a difficulty in the early years. One of them was exactly what we're talking about. This inward turn for me based on this. So it's remarkable, in fact, that I am still married after 30 years.
Yeah, well, congratulations on that. But same here. It's sort of like, you can find somebody who, and they're probably not going to understand it at first unless they're also engaged in something like that. Unless the sort of demonic force is quite strong in them as well.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you. So I'm always interested in, and this is one of the reasons I like this book of yours so much. I'm always interested in, I definitely have the side of me who, at least provisionally, buys into quite a few spiritual, religious, mystical concepts. But I also feel, maybe it's, I also have an engineering background. It's not my passion, but it's something that I do. And so some part of my brain has been deformed or shaped into an engineer, right? And so I always like it when I can feel how that stuff also works, when I can see not a rational explaining away, but a way to analogize it rationally, if that makes sense. Like, I'm not going to go too far into it because my listeners are probably bored with it already. Like, I practice the tarot. I do tarot readings, and to me, it means it's very meaningful, and I do think there is some mystical connotations, but I also like to be able to explain, quote unquote, how it works to people on a very rational basis, right? And so I was curious, what do you feel is the relationship between the demonic force and your relationship to it, or an artist's relationship to it, and what is called in psychology the flow state? Are these things two different ways of looking at the same thing? How do you see those two things fitting together?
Well, one could say that when we're operating in harmony with our daemon or muse, and I tend to put those together, the demon muse I refer to. You've seen me do that, right? The muse kind of has a different
I love that
flavor, but I mean, the demon muse is something that people have referred to. I put them together and talk about the demon being the fire that's pushing you, and the muse being kind of the realm of the ideas that are coming to you. And the flow state could be defined as when we are operating, kind of firing on all cylinders in perfect harmony with that, where this conscious self, where we so often feel like we're jaggedly sideways with our own selves. And when that happens, by the way, how can you have that duality within you? How can you be sideways with yourself? Humans are freaking weird creatures, you know?
Yeah, yeah, very
So
much.
self-awareness is a bitch. It really is. It's
Yeah, it
like,
is.
how can you be double like that? Well, when we are unself-conscious of our selves in an egoic sense, but we are using this outer shell aspect of ourselves, which is our conscious egoic mind, or are open to being used, right, in flow with the demon muse, that would be the flow state. It's like there is that intention, there's that fire from the demon that is like, you've got this energy, this excitement. It could be anger, it could be whatever, that's driving you. And the muse aspect is got the ideas and the content, whatever it is, coming clear either ahead of time, or more often for me, maybe it's the same for you, in the doing of it. If you're really on the edge of it and you see it's coming through well, you're getting feedback from what you're seeing, you're doing is helping guide it. And then you are out of the way. Self-consciousness and clumsiness from that and so on are gone. You feel like, man, I'm locked in. I'm in the zone. That's the flow state right there.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that makes perfect sense. I got curious too, thinking about, having sort of, I think the first time I came across your work was probably when you were on Weird Studies. And then having read To Rouse Leviathan, the stories in there, which are great. People should definitely read them. And then reading this book, I got thinking about sort of, when did Matt figure this out? Did he figure this out like early on in his career of writing fiction? I assume obviously it's evolved over time, but like, how much, where did you really start, I guess, this thinking about this process of getting your head around the demon muse in relationship to your career as a creative writer, or I guess as a musician too? I mean, maybe that all fits all together. Yeah,
sure. Late 1990s, early 2000s. As far as a capsule history of my writing career, I wanted to be a writer from the time I was a child. That was one of several things. And then not long after college, I had graduated from the University of Missouri and was living in Branson, was married, and wrote and I'd been into religion and philosophy and also supernatural horror and speculative fiction my whole life, with intensifications of it hugely in college and toward the end. So I find myself at age 24 in my basement writing a story that became Teeth. You're familiar with that story?
Yeah, Teeth's a great story. Yeah.
Thank you. And it was my first mature story, something worth trying. That's 94. I finished it, just poured out of me, and it's a philosophical, cosmic horror story that is proto-Legatian, even though I didn't read Legati for like 3 more years, so that was very strange.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. Yeah.
But the story is about, the main theme probably is the horror of sight. The idea that we all have this sense that we want to know what things really are, what our life really is, what the universe really is. Well, inspired by the likes of Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, and also the legacy of cosmic horror in Lovecraft and others, I was just transfixed by the idea, what if that's all backwards? What if we could really see what is, that would absolutely annihilate us, that reality is absolute horror. So you have all the stuff from Nietzsche and the birth of tragedy. You've seen the quotes in the story saying, no, we need to be lost in dreams, and all those things. That we have art that we do not die of truth, those kinds of things. That was really all over me, right? And so why was I so obsessed with all that? At the same time, I was incessantly reading philosophy and religion, and especially the literature of non-duality. And I was raised in an evangelical Christian tradition and was kind of on the cusp about those types of things. At some point, if you read supernatural horror fiction, especially weird fiction, you can understand it. One total way of understanding it, and I had really been into it, is to look at it as stories about whoever the protagonist is, being sort of walking and living in a dream landscape, whether or not it's presented as such, where everything is meaningful. It's like a nightmare or dream landscape, a world of synchronicities and weird menacing meanings and so on and so forth. That's not so far from the daimonic state where you're seeing synchronicities, you're feeling this presence or whatever. Robert Anton Wilson famously talked about chapel perilous, the chapel perilous experience. Others have talked about that, where the Arthurian legend of the Grail has the perilous chapel, that Percival or Galahad have to go to get the Grail. And the metaphor talks about that state of psychology or spirit being one where you feel like maybe you're seeing synchronicities happen, and maybe there's an intelligence or some force that's helping you or harming you or around or whatever in your life, grouping things. But then you also are fully aware that this may be complete crap, that you just may be delusional. So you're stuck.
Right.
These types of things were things that I had been imbibing for a long time. Don't remember where I first came across the term daemon or demon, or in that sense, put it together with the muse. But in the late 90s or early 2000s, it really came clear. And I was writing in my journal to myself about it. I've journaled intensively for 30 years, and ST Joshi kind of convinced me 3 or 4 years ago to publish those. So I've got 2 volumes of my collected 30-year journals that are out now. And you can see that in there. I started, the first place it came out for me self-consciously in my creative work was in music. I was working at a piano and keyboard store in 2004, and being around that music all the time, and I'd played piano my whole life, started really pouring out of me, and I would sort of stay in the store after hours and use the gear there to be recording some stuff on the sequencers and all that, and turned into an album that was published a few years later with Dark Awakenings from Mythos Books. And I titled the album, it's 2 words. The first is Demonics, Daemonyx, and then sort of subtitled Curse of the Daemon. And the running theme throughout the instrumental, it's all instrumental, cinematic and electronic music with some rock and metal and all that in there. The running theme, and in a couple of songs it comes out explicitly, is that of domination by a creative force that is simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. So it was really in the early 2000s, and partly through that album coming clear, that I was obsessed with it for like 4 years. It took me to make all that music, that came through to me. And also there are some songs on there where sort of inspired by, I don't know, the likes of Skinny Puppy and Rob Zombie and the whole style of music that will put film sort of excerpts and samples in there. I do have 1 or 2 songs with lyrics completely made up of film clips. And I'd realized I'd been gathering consciously and unconsciously for decades movies that were my favorites. All of them had that theme of possession of the person in a way by something else, like Network. Have you seen Network from the 1970s? The greatest anti-television movie in history. What about Howard Beale, the mad prophet of the airwaves? The network news anchor who comes out with the whole, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take this anymore. All of his screeds against watching TV, but he's a possessed prophet. And there's the scene in it where his mission is being given to him, and he's lying awake at night talking in bed to someone who's not there. And then he's got this energy that's having him give these amazing speeches and rants to a mesmerized television audience about, turn your television off. This is an insane dream world. You people are insane. You're thinking that television's reality and your own lives are unreal. And then he passes out at the end, classic possession behavior. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Exorcist, Frailty. A lot of your listeners will remember Frailty with Bill Paxton. I was like, whoa, all these movies that are both horror movies and not about demons or about the personality having some other energy infusing it. I have especially one song on the album that's titled Daemonica, and its lyrics make a coherent message about this force and the feeling of this force, and they're drawn from I think it's 14 different movies. So that's where that all came clear to me. And then I started writing about it, and the first place I really wrote about it was a blog long before The Living Dark, which I only started in 22. Started that first one in 2009, and it was titled Demon Muse. And I blogged there for 3 years. I found I couldn't technically handle all the bots that were corrupting the site. And anyway, but I ended up writing my first book on creativity from material that I'd published there, and it is A Course in Demonic Creativity. And you notice the subtitle similarity to the new book, right? A Course in Demonic Creativity, the subtitle is A Writer's Guide to the Inner Genius. For Writing at the Wellspring, the subtitle is Tapping the Source of Your Inner Genius. And you can really view Writing at the Wellspring as both a standalone book that's complete on its own and as sort of a sequel to and extension of what I wrote about in A Course in Demonic Creativity. That first one lays out a complete view with historical chapters on the development of the idea of the muse and the daemon and all these things in history. And it is a step-by-step, chapter-by-chapter, here is learning about this aspect of your psyche and self. Here's some philosophical talk about whether you should view it as real or just metaphor or don't pass judgment. Here's advice on actually getting to know, act as if you're collaborating with someone else. Here's advice on getting to understand the unique needs and desires, right down to like, what do you write with? A typewriter, a pen, of your particular creative spirit. All these years later, writing at the Wellspring, as you know, has a whole lot of that. The first third of the book is largely devoted to the idea of the muse, the demon, and then is much more also, it much more fuses that with the philosophical or spiritual outlook and experience of non-duality, of recognizing the ultimately constructed nature of our personal identity overall, and recognizing that through this collaboration with this seeming creative self, we can actually find our spiritual path to waking up from the dream of self and world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's all great stuff. And I am going to have to go back to sort of part one of Writing at the Wellspring. I haven't read that one yet, but I'm certainly going to. And I am interested also sort of just intellectually in this history of this concept. I mean, it strikes me that this is something that many artists and creative people were at least aware of up until the sort of maybe the 20th century or something. We sort of maybe pushed it all aside because it seems like woo-woo. But I read, for the first time, I read Paradise Lost last year, or I guess it was almost 2 years ago now. And that a large portion of the beginning of that book is devoted to invoking the muse. And this, I think, to a modern reader, that sounds like it's just a kind of framing, or it kind of sounds right or something like that, which maybe it is. But, Milton was actually calling upon the muse, I think. I think later on he reported elsewhere that he was having an interaction, that the entire massive tome of Paradise Lost, which is sort of the inaugural text almost to English language poetic tradition, is essentially transcription from an angel. So this is, I feel like what you're getting into in laying all of this out for us and Writing at the Wellspring is actually helping us sort of return to how things were more frequently done, perhaps in previous eras. Yeah. Because I think we do end up in this, we talked a little bit off mic and we won't get too deep into it, but a little bit about just launching the book and how that all went. And I think we do tend to get lost in some of that for very good reasons. Like, how much did it sell? What are my networking opportunities and all these things, which we have to think about because we live in the modern era, but it can definitely, I think, maybe take us away from, because I don't think our muse cares about any of that. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say. Yeah, it's like you have we can put it in a left brain, right brain context, right? Kind of, do an Ian McGilchrist thing and talk about the left brain being the emissary and the right brain being the master is the way it should work, right? Mm-hmm. I think so many people are familiar with his master emissary framework these days, and the idea that in the modern Western civilization, we've let the what should be the servant part of the total human psychological, even biological makeup usurp what should be the drive, right? So that we have the conscious ego self thinking it's in charge, right? The whole thing about the invocations to the muse was, if you want to look at it this way, and of course that's something that goes well, 1 or 2,000 years or more before Milton, back in history, right? To where you have the Homer opening the Iliad, "Sing to me, O muse, of the wrath of Achilles." or the
Right,
Odyssey.
right.
Sing to me of Odysseus, that crafty man of many wiles. That's
Yeah,
you so open with sing muse. You invite the muse, right? You're trying to set the master emissary situation correct. You're like, I am just your vessel. That's how
right.
you open. You invoke the muse, and
Yeah,
we did get that out of whack. And there's a history of that, and there are histories written of that, and probably one a lot of people I know are familiar with. In case you're not, I would urge you and your listeners to go watch Elizabeth Gilbert's TED Talk from some years back, from 15, 18 years
so
ago, that
good.
was so massively popular, where
Hmm.
she's talking all about this. Her point is to resurrect the ancient view of the genius. That's the other name. The Romans
Yeah,
called it the genius, the spirit that would live in the artist's workshop or in the poet's studio.
yeah,
And she was talking about what we were talking about before we started recording this, about removing both the inflation of pride and the deflation and the pain of guilt that we wrongly assume for ourselves when we think of ourselves as being solely responsible for the output and the success. That's
yes.
another handy thing about whether, again, and I can't emphasize this enough, whether you take the muse, the demon muse, as literal, whether you really want to believe in some higher self or some spiritual source, which a lot of people want to do,
Mhm.
or whether you want to say, it sounds interesting, but I hold it to be 100% metaphor. It's
Right.
just psychological metaphor. That's perfectly fine. I would not argue anybody away from either of those poles. I find the most fertile place to be in the chapel perilous position in the middle, where you realize that because of our inescapable ensconcement in our first personhood, we cannot know. Absolutely 100%, but not an absentee, sort of apathetic agnosticism, one where you're like, I have to know, but I recognize
Yeah,
that I can't know. That's the fertile spot.
yeah,
You have that sense, however you take it, and okay, I'm shepherding my creative force. That is the thing within me that I need to bring out. And if it does wonderfully, what does wonderfully even mean? Maybe it even sets the terms for what success and failure for itself would be.
that could very well
Tell you
be.
what,
Yeah.
that's really that's a powerful place to be. Now,
Hmm.
if you're like me, and I know you probably are, and so is everybody listening, if you have a creative bent, maybe not everyone, almost everyone wants to think that it would be so wonderful to be able to just live like that, to just have that be your living. The more standard way for anyone is to finance your art with something else.
Right,
Probably most commonly being a teacher, but you can be a barista. You
right.
can you can you can build houses. You can be an Uber driver. You can be a lawyer. You can be anything. And most people don't live solely on their art,
Right.
and even fewer today maybe than used to. Although people who are sort of cheerleaders for the creator economy, put scare quotes around that term, always would probably say otherwise. But
Sure.
I don't know. I mean, I think we're worse off many times if we try and take that burden onto us, because then it takes it right into, I'm going to define success. And it means
Yeah.
I have to be making this amount of money per month because I need to support this, and I'm going to be selling this
Right.
many copies of it, or I'm going to be getting this many interviews. And that's fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But if that's how you're going to be measuring success, that might not be how your creative
Well,
partner
yeah,
intends to do that.
yeah. It's dangerous. I mean, because it puts the emissary in the master position in this Ian
Yes.
McGilchrist frame, right? And yeah, that is a challenging. You can end up ruining both, I think, so for some people, right? You end up both not making the living, because that's incredibly difficult to do, and not creating the work that you might have otherwise made, not actually bringing that thing out of you, and it thereby just it thereby destroys you. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, these are I think you make an interesting point about whether it's easier or not to make a living now. I mean, I've only lived now, so I really don't know, but I suspect it's much like many other things in which the spoils are accruing to a small group of people, and those spoils are getting bigger, and the rest of us are sort of picking up change. So,
It's interesting how the whole thing, even kind of forthrightly, is a pyramid scheme, because most
mhm,
people who are cheerleaders for the creator economy and say there's never been a better time to be a creator. What are they
right.
writing about? They're writing about the creator economy. They're writing about
Yes.
how there's never been a better time to be a creator. And what should you
Yes.
do? You should be telling
Yeah.
people there's never been a better time to be a creator. What about all the novels we could write? What about all the
Right.
songs we could become a cheerleader and monetize being a cheerleader for creating? It's a whole swindle. It
Yeah.
completely
It's
is.
yeah, it's interesting. I just became somewhat active on Substack within the last year, and when I first got on, before the algorithm knew me, before I followed too many people or anything, just started getting my feet in there and starting to subscribe to some people I knew and some new people. It Everything it was feeding me was telling me how to get them like the most impressions and the most engagement on Substack. That was all the content it was feeding me. And it was like, is this how like it seems like this snake eating its own tail here. Like we can't all just be generating content about how to generate content on here. We
There you
all
go. And
some of us have to do something, right? Yeah.
yeah, and it wasn't
Yeah.
it wasn't always like that. I got on in 2022, and of course it's been
Yeah.
around since, I forget, 2020, 2018, 2017,
Mm.
whatever. But it was kind of famous for being the place that wasn't about that. And
Right.
then there was a change. It really just well, in 24, 25, there was a huge,
Yeah.
especially 25, where the crowd that we're talking about descended upon it in force and found it and are kind of doing their part to make it more like X. But
Right.
there's still a whole lot of people who are actually making things on there, just like
Yes.
many other platforms have.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
kind of
No.
an interesting time.
Yeah, just like any of the social media, you kind of have to, if you're going to be on there, you really have to be careful to curate what your experience is as much as you can. It doesn't prevent all of it from getting in there, but yeah, you definitely have to kind of seize control of your experience on there to some degree. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I did want to ask you. Uh, there's there's a couple chapters that I'm very interested in their specific sort of content and the somewhat maybe even surprising message in there. But maybe we'll just focus on one. And this is the chapter called "Breaking the Spell." Sorry, breaking the spell. I think it's maybe breaking the spell of words.
It
Um,
is.
and I don't want to give too much of it away, but let me ask a sort of adjacent question to the topic of that chapter, and kind of we'll see how much it relates. I'm getting more and more curious asking this question about people who strike me as very well read, as you are. How do you plan out your reading? What does that look like for you? Do you know what you're reading 3 months from now? Do you know what the next book is? How does that all work? And I know your job at the university plays into this. Probably what you're working on with the Living Dark Substack plays into this. Your next book plays into this. But how does that look for you?
It looks completely intuitive and unscheduled.
Wow.
The past 3 years, I have made a reading list for myself based on things that have been kind of backlogged. And I think look at when the year turns, right before the turn of each year, I look at what I'm reading now, look back at what I have read previously, and for the past couple of years, I've published what I read this year, post at the Living Dark in late December, and so I have a Remarkable 2, which is a wonderful tool, the tablet with
Yeah.
the marker pen, it's great. I love it. And so I make a list in there for myself of things I know that I want to read, because it's possible that over time I'll forget. I was excited
Yes.
about this book, and then I forgot I ever wanted that book, and so I don't get it. And then later, 5 years later, wait, I never read that book.
Right.
So both the physical and electronic books, I have for the past 3 years been making a list for myself at the end of the year, going, here's what I'm reading right now. Here are books that I've gathered I don't want to forget. And I do put down what I think will be an order in which I'll read them. And it is kind of nice to be able to finish a book, do whatever it is I'm going to do with that book, either just have appreciated it or not, and use it in some of my writing or not, or use it for further research or not, and then go, what am I going to read now? Oh, I have a list. Well, here's the next thing on the list,
Yeah.
And I have two lists. One is sort of a list of core spiritual books I'm constantly reading. And then the other is just everything else, which not total, not 100%, but a good 95% is stuff in the nonfiction realm for many years now. That said, I am not self-consciously pursuing a course of reading in anything, and I'm not scheduling them out. And I read every morning when I get up, I meditate and then have coffee while I'm reading. And I just read whatever feels. Sometimes I'm reading one book at a time. Sometimes I'm reading 4 books, cycling from one to the other. And I just kind of read at whatever pace. I don't do, I need to read 20 pages. I don't think I need to read this because I haven't read it in a while. Whatever it is I'm feeling like. So I kind of got a loose framework, but within that, I'm just do whatever I feel led to do on the day. And even the framework itself is subject to change. At the end of my undergraduate years, I vividly remember, because I was majoring in communication with an emphasis in radio and TV production, and I actually incorporated this into one of my student video projects that I made sort of a surreal depiction of my own life as someone who was burned out by university life and was sort of entering realms of hallucination and had to get out of there.
Yeah.
I kind of sort of brought into that project the idea that I was obsessed with learning and reading and so on, but I had been in formal education my entire life and for probably more than half of my college career been at the point where I just want to be set free to follow whatever the energies of the moment are. But I still had bunches of classes left to take, which each one has its own syllabus and its program of reading. And I really chafed for the last 2 years of my college. I mean, I went on to get a master's degree some years later and a PhD. That was, that was deliberate. But I enjoy reading with abandon. And I do feel like, for my purposes, maybe for anybody's purposes, reading intuitively like that. It's kind of like, intuitive eating, that whole field of intuitive eating, which I know about, I've never done. I don't know what the evidence says about whether it actually has any particular health impact. I would say intuitive reading can be really important and can be a way to just be led to what you're meant to find. You get the book genie bringing things to you that you just were like, that's perfect. How did that happen?
Right.
At the same time, I am grateful for formal education and for the more programmatic way that it gets at things. I really feel like when we're young, the culture may have shifted too far in some areas. I'm going to sound like a conservative here in the area of unschooling and whatever, and saying the kids need to be allowed to do whatever moves them to a certain extent. But that's also like saying your 12-year-old should be allowed to eat whatever they want,
Right.
Let them. I don't think intuitive eating is going to work for a 13-year-old boy. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So,
It's going to be Slim
I think
Jims and
some
candy.
foundation and some guided way of shaping people's abilities and informing their sensibilities somehow with something. Then you get into the curriculum war, which is totally out, in my field of education.
I had an interesting, probably one of my most sort of influential English teachers as a high school student. Definitely was like, there was more reading than I'd had in any class up until that time. And, I don't know, I think I was a sophomore or a junior. But I remember, and he was very intense on setting things up. So, if you didn't actually do the reading, you weren't going to be able to skate by, you actually had to read the book. And I remember at one point he gave us, well, you can read one of these 4 books. That was like his way of introducing some choice and some optionality in there. And at that time, I thought that was great because it was, and even in retrospect, because it was, okay, I'm not going to read all 4 of them in this 2 weeks or whatever it was, but getting a limited range of recommendations, and then I can kind of pick what suits my fancy seemed like a pretty good option.
And that's helpful. And that's helpful. In that chapter, Breaking the Spell of Words, if I recall, that's part of that's part of part 2 of the book, as I recall. And part 2 of the book, as you know, is about silence and about the sort of the drying up of the creative drive that comes to so many of us, and just the desire that comes over so many of us who want to think of ourselves as writers and creators, to just chuck it all. To just let it go, just absolutely fall inert. And I was surprised how many people that spoke to when I started writing about it at The Living Dark. And that, like I say, that chapter on Breaking the Spell of Words is about that. It's like we're terrified, some of us, to stop, to give into that. But when we hear somebody describe it, say, don't you ever just feel like you wish, this goes back to the start of our conversation, you wish you just didn't have that thing, eating at you, driving you? Don't you just wish you could let yourself give into that blissful total stillness and stasis. And it seems like so far in my experience, anybody who hears it from this crowd we're part of says,
Yeah.
yes, I know exactly what you mean. I both love this thing and find that I sort of wish I could just go zen and just shut up, just sit and do nothing for the rest of my life, sit on a park bench for the rest of my life. What is that? How is that duality there? And so in that whole part 2 of the book, I'm trying to chase down the nature of that and point out that's real. It could be something to actually give into. I mean, I remember, you may remember, I quote that portion of Eckhart Tolle. I think it's from The Power of Now. It may be from A New Earth, his other book. But he says, sometimes you may find that you have that sense of withdrawing. He says, if you're feeling like you're fighting to still move and do anything, he's like, just why not give into it as fully as you can? Why not just absolutely succumb to it? And he says, these lines have just rung with me ever since I read them in the late 1990s, if it was in The Power of Now. He says, eventually you'll come out of it.
Yeah.
And then the next sentence says, or maybe you won't. and then he says, either way, you're at peace. You're no longer in conflict with yourself. And the whole deal about giving into that, maybe breaking the spell over yourself by going, you know what, I have found, or maybe you can find, is my point, a way to be okay with the notion that perhaps you, for some time, or maybe for all time, might stop writing, stop creating, stop talking. What would that be like? Can you be okay with that? If not, you've got a hard taskmaster that you're serving. I know you see the relationship to the idea of the force that drives you.
Yeah,
but what if your muse went silent and that was right for you? What if that was your creativity at that point?
Yeah,
I mean, this has all kinds of levels to it.
Yeah, it's almost a chilling sort of the part of the identity that is clung to the creative process is I can feel it terrified at that prospect. But I also know so I just recently put a book out, and it had been finished for a while, but I took some time to do a final proof, just a proof copy, and I self-published. So I did all of the typesetting and all of that myself. And so my normal writing time was kind of dedicated to just getting the book out. And I'd had another long form project, in a draft stage. And, my assumption was, well, as soon as I put that book out, the next day I'll be back to work on this other project that's partially formed. And man, I just couldn't get back into it. And I made the decision, I think partially from reading I know it came largely from reading your book, where I was like, well, I'm just not going to stress this. I'm just going to take the time that I would normally spend on the writing, and I'm just going to sit there. I'll just sit there. And maybe I'll write a little something in my notebook that has nothing to do with the project. Maybe I'll just have the printed out pages sitting on the desk, but I'm just going to sit here and I'm just going to wait. And sure enough, I did that for 4 or 5 days, maybe a week. And then just this morning, I was like, oh yeah, I know what I'm doing. Right back to work. And but I would take, every day I was taking an hour to 2 hours a day, just sitting there and not stressing about it, not thinking, oh my God, am I ever going to do this? Am I ever going to get back to it? Let's just see what it's like to sit here and see if it kind of just comes back on its own. And it did.
I love it.
It's a very mysterious process. I wanted to talk a little bit about The Living Dark. You write on a bunch of different subjects, and so many of these articles are so great. Let me just throw some titles out there for people. One is Cosmic Horror as Spiritual Practice. One is We Are All Artificial Intelligences. One is Writing Non-Duality and the Lurking Presence Beyond the Form. So and there's many articles in this vein, and if you're interested in this conversation and some of those titles pop for you, definitely go check them out. I was really interested in this project you did recently of bibliomancy. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm pretty enthusiastic about the tarot, and the tarot is in history, it's actually very related to bibliomancy. It seems that people were doing bibliomancy and then they were like, hey, we have these playing cards. Will it work for this? That seems to be kind of the genesis of divinatory tarot practice to a certain extent. But tell me a little bit about that practice. Is some kind of randomized divination, for lack of a better word, has that been part of how you do things normally? Was this just an experiment? Tell me a little bit about that.
I first discovered bibliomancy without the name, and as you know, I explained this in the opening post in that series, through reading Richard Bach's Illusions, The Adventures of a Reluctant Messiah, which was his next book after Jonathan Livingston Seagull. So, it's this 1970s, or I forget, was it 1980 for Illusions, New Age classic. And in it, he has that fictional character that he presents as real. It's a fake memoir, right? It's a spiritual memoir of Don Shimoda, the ex-Messiah that he meets. Ask him, haven't you ever done that? Haven't you ever picked up just anything, any printed matter at hand and used it to find a meaning for yourself? And he says, no, the fictionalized version of Richard the author. And Don tells him, well, try it sometime. It works. And the idea is pick a soup can, pick a book, pick a piece of newspaper that comes up to you on the street. How about a random billboard or whatever? If you're in the right frame of mind, and I think many of us are familiar with it, that sense of heightenedness where you maybe have deliberately cultivated a feeling of connection and synchronicities are imminent. I'm sort of open to meaning. Pick anything. And as you know, it was 7 days of bibliomancy. I sort of had a system I'd come up with the bookshelf in my college office. I would just stand in front of and just kind of blindly reach out and grope, and whatever book my hand hit first, I'd pull it off and then blindly open it and just pick somewhere what passage is there. And as you know, if you read it, I got stuff from Shakespeare, from A Midsummer Night's Dream, and I got stuff from The Great Gatsby and Gilgamesh, and it was just The Crucible, Arthur Miller's play about the Salem witch trials. I mean, it was some interesting stuff. And I was trying to use it like reading tea leaves or reading the tarot. And I haven't done that. That hasn't been something that I've practiced like always. I encountered that in that book Illusions in high school and didn't see it referred to as bibliomancy until many years later. But the idea, seems like I bounced into it here and there over time. And what I think is interesting with that there's two levels of interest with that whole way of doing things and seeing what meanings might come out in your life or in your creative work. One is just you are able to witness the creative workings of your own mind. It sort of brings whatever is subconscious up, and you learn how your conscious patterns work. It's like if I'm asked, what does this mean? This as random as you can make it piece of text, whether it's from the soup can or from the book where you just randomly pointed at something. What do you mean? What does it mean? What are you talking? Well, tell me, if you force yourself to say, how does this relate to anything going on in your life right now, anything you're interested in, anything that comes, what does it bring up? What does it make you think of? You can do this through sheer free writing alone, but if you have some grist for the mill in front of you, well, the back of the soup can, I don't know, you may read some lines on there, and the fact that it's on a soup can makes you remember eating soup when you were a kid, and you go, okay, you start writing about that. And then, whoa, infinite something to talk about opens out in relation to the words on that can. You saw me dealing with the passages I got from those books, kind of looking at their literary placement and what the themes seemed to be within the work, and then saying, well, that was weird. If you followed along, you saw where there was a whole theme that I didn't have in mind when I started, and it was clearly connected across the books that came out about the nature of narrative and specific commentary on the nature of storytelling and the kind of dream world that's created by that, and the question of people's perceptions and lies covering up reality, or reality wanting to be seen. And it was bizarre how it just came together. I hadn't planned that. I couldn't. So there's the level where you go, I can just see how my own mind works. The other part is kind of more in that it really seemed synchronistic what was happening when I did it and shared the public results. Like, maybe I am tapped into something, because you're into tarot. The idea with the tarot, and I've never done tarot. I find the whole thing fascinating, but the I Ching was my thing for some years. I was really into that. it's like, if anything in the world is meaningful, what do we mean by meaning? How do
Right.
you define or quantify that? Is something meaningful? Well, give yourself something to hang your hat on. Use a divination tool that's built for that, like the tarot, like the I Ching, like runes or whatever. And it's like there's a randomness to it, and then you get interpretive commentary that you can read and so on, and you're trying to hook it to your life situation and say, what is this saying? Many people might think that's just total randomness. You're just making something up.
Right.
Well, what about the fact that you're seeing the room from where you're seeing it right now? Brad and I'm seeing the room from where I'm seeing it, and got this laptop in front of me and these things on the desk around me and so on. It's like, what could I read in the configuration of these? How is reality? How is my perception? How is this experience happening right now and structured as it is? There's a line of thinking that says everything is just infinitely meaningful, whatever that means in itself. You can just read the shape of whatever you're seeing. It's just when we do it in textual form or with a classic divinatory tool, it gives you a further angle into it, and you can use that for creative purposes as well. I know there are whole systems of books about using the tarot, using the I Ching to write or something. This is fascinating. And is it tapping into something real? It's as real. I like to go back to saying it's as real as you and I are.
Yeah, it's real, right. Well, and it also strikes me too that this very much relates to that first, I know the Gospel of Thomas quote, about bringing that which is within you out. And because that's been my experience with tarot, and I've done a little bit of bibliomancy. Particularly, I used to randomly flip to pages in Finnegan's Wake, just because it's a very rich text, right? And so
that book is built for that kind of thing. Like it's like a random access dream.
Yeah. Well, reading, it's almost random, just going from front to back is the experience of it. So, but there is something in there and the forcing yourself to say, the proposition of like, I don't know what this is. It's quote unquote random, but I'm going to decide that it's meaningful and sort of see what emerges. I do think that is almost like, whether or not there are mystical, metaphysical connotations to this, I tend to think that there are, but it is sort of it's at a very minimum is a trick to, in my opinion, bring subconscious material to the surface, because you're forcing yourself to like, what does this mean? and you're automatically going to start grabbing stuff. And I think in that grabbing at things in process, you start raising things to the surface. So
you do, and it becomes meta in a hurry, which is kind of what I was talking about a minute ago. And I know you know this too. It's like, then you say, well, if I'm doing this with this, what does anything mean? How does anything mean anything? What do my personal relationships mean? What does my relationship with my wife mean? What does my relationship to the chair that I'm sitting in mean? What does my relationship to my job mean? What is even my job? How do I define the boundaries of my job? How do I define the boundaries of myself? It's very interesting how when you foreground the meaning-making capacity that you have, and kind of in a sense that you are, it raises the question for everything. And you can really get into a state. I keep going back to the chapel perilous notion, because it is so fertile. It can really kick you into a place where you're like, okay, you said you tend to think there really is something mystical or metaphysical about it.
Sure. Yeah.
Or maybe not. How could you know? How could I know? It seems so much like it, but maybe it just seems like it. But if it seems like it, that must mean it is like it, because it's what is seeming, and on and on. If you really dig down into it, it's like the lesson of it, really, I think the wider lesson is that, like I said, anything and everything is a divinatory tool, and it's not. When I was a kid, I remember an episode of Laverne. I think it was Laverne and Shirley, and that was something like late 70s, early 80s, and so. Sitcoms, even in American sitcoms, sometimes were clued into the counterculture new age thing that was kind of going on, and there was I think it was like it was either Laverne or Shirley had gotten into some hippie-ish spiritual thing. And I never forgot, they were the show was kind of mocking it, making fun of it. Somebody there had shown her, she could see the universe in her hand, right? And so she tries to go show it to either Laverne or Shirley, which one it was. What do you see there? I see your hand. No, it's the universe, and it's kind of making fun of it, right? But but for real, you're right.
Right.
If you learn to do it with a book or with
Yeah.
the I Ching or with the tarot or
No,
anything,
if you
you can learn to do it with anything.
if you study your hand long enough, you will get. I mean, if you were to just sit in a room by yourself and stare at your hand for long enough,
Yes.
if you were willing to do that exercise, your mind would go into some pretty strange territory. I think you would start picking things, or ask yourself the question, "What does my hand mean?" That could launch you off on a pretty radical experience if you're in the
What does my
right.
hand mean? What does the question mean? What does me asking the question, what my hand means,
Yeah. Yeah.
mean? And I mean, it unlocks, it just suddenly unlocks. And it's like, it's in a very real sense, all that's ever been happening,
Yeah. Yeah.
all that has ever been happening since you and I opened eyes on this experience that we call life, which is really, there's been no time. It's the same thing as when we were born and just this world appeared to us, right? All that's ever been happening is infinite meaning has been thrown at us in the form of these patterns that are just wild. The pattern of the room right now that seems humdrum is just insane. It's impossible. How is this experience happening right now? Anything that can get you to edge to that point where you leap off into that sense of whatever it is, the very fact that I'm even able to be perceiving anything and think of myself as a thing, as someone perceiving something, asking these questions is wild. It's almost impossible. What the hell is this?
Yeah.
Anything that can get you to that ledge to jump off, I think is good. And you notice, by the way, when I say all these things, part of it, you're talking about like mystical experience, or are you talking about those weird horror stories that we were talking about earlier, where the whole sense of weird horror is of being trapped in some kind of dark dream where everything is meaningful and there's some intelligence lurking behind the surface appearance of things. This all curls back around to itself.
It absolutely does. That's great. I want to kind of, no, that was amazing. And I don't really want to ask you too many more questions, except the kind of question that I ask pretty much every guest, or at least every first time guest. Could you give my audience 2 or 3 books out of your personal canon? These are books that are important to you, but are maybe a little bit under discussed or under remarked.
Sure. If we're talking about creativity and writing and all that, I have an instant go-to. Actually, I have 2. I'll give you 2 for there.
Okay, great.
One is by Victoria Nelson, who, I don't know if you're familiar with her. Many people are. She wrote The Secret Life of Puppets, which is like a life-changing book about the dark, mystical, platonic underside of life in the world, showing itself to us in a left-brained Aristotelian culture through the back door of fantasy, horror, and science fiction. But that's not the book I'm recommending.
Okay.
I do recommend that book. But she had an earlier book titled On Writer's Block.
Oh, okay.
And it was originally titled Writer's Block and How to Use It. And it was published, I think, as a Writer's Digest book, if I remember.
Interesting.
But the book On Writer's Block, which is the title I encountered it under, I cannot recommend highly enough. I won't dwell on it for a long time. It's not just about block. The subtitle, I think, is a new way of looking at or understanding creativity. It is about, and it is also the source field, the bed from which I got many of the things that I write about and talk about with creativity. The book is about the whole creative experience and struggle. And she has said that she was really thinking in terms of like Freudian psychology and levels of the psyche and the ego and the unconscious, and you can see that, but she doesn't go into all that. She talks all about the silences that I talk about. Right. She talks in writing at the Wellspring. She talks all about the need to view and understand and feel your creative work as something that you are nurturing and cooperating with. You can understand how, even though she doesn't talk about the muse and the daemon, you can understand how this was foundational for me, right? And she talks about it in as penetrating and useful, elegant a way as you can possibly imagine. And I mean, it's comforting. It's just so wise. I can't recommend it enough. On Writer's Block. Okay. Another one outside that vein, kind of totally separately, is by Theodore Roszak. Are you familiar with Roszak?
That name rings a bell. I don't know that I know. I've read anything.
Roszak. Roszak.
Okay.
Some of your readers might be familiar with him maybe because he wrote the memoirs of Elizabeth Frankenstein, which was a retelling of the Frankenstein story from Elizabeth's point of view, a
I've
feminist
heard of
retelling.
that. Yeah, I haven't read it, but
Yep.
I'm sort of familiar with its existence. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
He also wrote the glorious novel in the 1990s titled Flicker, which was actually very famously going to be developed as a movie directed by Darren Aronofsky, and it never came to be. But that book will blow your brains out.
Wow.
It's
Okay.
about what if the entire history of cinema, not the content of it, but the actual way the medium works, is actually a giant Gnostic conspiracy to project the second century Gnosticism's nihilistic hatred of the physical body and the material world. It is absolutely
Wow.
unbelievably amazing.
I am 100% sold on that.
That
Both of
and
these
that's not even
sound
the one I
great,
wanted.
but that's like a right
Yeah.
into my veins kind of book.
Oh, there's nothing better than that novel. And
Okay.
that's kind of funny. That's not even the one I wanted to mention from
Yeah.
Rozak. I'll kind of
Yeah.
be quick about
Okay.
this. He
Yeah.
he was. I first encountered him in his scholarly nonfiction mode. He was a professor in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. He well known. He actually is the person who coined the term counterculture,
Oh.
and that was in a series of articles that he wrote for The Nation magazine. And those articles were turned into he turned into a book that's a classic book that basically made him like the respectable intellectual philosophical voice of the counterculture, and it was titled The Making of a Counterculture. It's like essential reading for 20th century, mid-late 20th century American and British understanding of philosophical currents. The book that introduced me to him, I was in college, I kept seeing it in the college bookstore, and I just bought it and read it as a pleasure read in the summer between my junior and senior years, and it's a foundational book for me now. It's titled Where the Wasteland Ends. And it's subtitled Politics and Transcendence in Post-Industrial Society. And what it's about is the reductionist materialism, mechanistic materialism, scientism, nihilism of the industrial technocratic world order, and everything about the economics and philosophy and sort of spiritual or anti-spiritual view of that. Think classic counterculture critiques of modern consumerism and technocratic ways of doing things and technology, and that's the whole first third or half of the book. And the last half is where he lays out his vision and sort of guidelines of what he calls a science of rhapsodic intellect that might replace that. He's huge into Blake and the Romantic poets. He's also huge into certain religious and mystical philosophy and so on, and is laying out an idea for how we can not do away with the gains of the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment culture, while also getting past the spiritual catastrophe by which we bought into our own story about a mechanistic cosmos and wrote ourselves out of existence. And that is a very classic counterculture philosophical theme from the 60s and 70s, and Alan Watts was all about that too. Rozak moved in those circles. He knew Watts. He knew all these, famous people. And anyway, that book was a philosophical foundation for me. I'm kidding you not. So those are two of my books, that one and all the others I talked about. But Where the Wasteland Ends by Theodore Rozak. For creative purposes, Victoria Nelson's On Writer's Block. And then the only other writer's book, and I won't say anything about it, is Becoming a Writer by Dorothea Brand. It came out in the 1930s. And if you think that you mentioned the way you described my book at the start was that it's not a guidebook for how to do the technical part of writing and how to structure your novels or how to do this and that, but it's more about the whole person, your life and creativity, like we've been talking about. Her book was one of the first to do that, and she even says this is not a book about technique. Basically, most instruction in writing gets it backwards. Can genius be taught? Can you get someone in touch with their total portion of genius, the thing that they might be meant to be as a writer? Her book said that's what I'm about. She says only after maybe you have been able to do something like that would any instruction and practical technique even have any meaning, because otherwise what's a person going to write about?
Right.
So that's what her book is about, and it's justly a classic.
No, that sounds, those all sound, I haven't read any of these, and these all sound incredible. So thank you so much for that. And Matt, overall, just thank you so much for this conversation. I really, really enjoyed it. I know the people who listen to the show are going to enjoy it. And folks out there, go buy Writing at the Wellspring. Go check out Matt's other books. There'll be links to the show notes, links in the show notes to everything, including his wonderful Substack, The Living Dark. And Matt, just Thanks, and I wish you all the best in with writing at the Wellspring and whatever you've got coming next.
You too, Brad. I appreciate it, and I wish you all the best in your own writing.
Thank you.